Before I talk about the history of the Bush Library, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the National Archives, the agency I work for, and also a little bit about the history of presidential papers, because I think it shines light on our topic today. The National Archives is really a relatively new organization in the United States. It was only created in the 1930s, and I know that sounds like a long time ago, but given the history of the country, it's not all that long, especially when you go back and look at European state archives that existed for centuries. And the movement of the National Archives of the United States came about mostly in the South. And in fact, there were state archives located throughout the South before there was a National Archives. My home state, Alabama, had the first state archive. Now, why would southern states want to create state archives? They were mostly created right after the Civil War. And of course, the reason was the side that lost the Civil War wanted to maintain the records and the legacy of the Great Lost Cause. And so Alabama, Mississippi, and most southern states had a state archive. And that movement for national archives actually was in part created through the creation of these state archives, culminating in a long process, but actually culminating in the 1930s in the Hoover administration, and the National Archives was built in the Roosevelt administration. Mostly out of Johns Hopkins University, which had a strong history background the archives movement came from. Excuse me. Early in the history of the National Archives, President Roosevelt came to the first archivist of the United States, and he said there's been Roosevelt had a keen interest in history. There had been a very poor job done of preserving presidential papers. 2 presidents lost their papers when their homes were sacked and burned, Tyler and Taylor, so you don't have to remember if it was Tyler or Taylor, it was both of them. And there's the great story of one president whose son believed his father's 3 trunks of papers were being stored. He recalled those 3 trunks to see this great wealth of presidential papers, to find that nothing but excise papers were in the boxes. His father's presidential papers had completely disappeared, and they were never found. So there had been a pretty poor job of collecting presidential papers. The Library of Congress went around and tried to collect as many collections as they could, and for Presidents Washington all the way through Coolidge, they probably have the best collection of presidential papers, but they're very sparse. Some presidents have a lot, some presidents don't have any. The Adams, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, they store their papers at the Massachusetts Historical Association, and the Massachusetts Historical Association has done a great job of preserving those. And if you remember, we did an exhibit several years ago called Fathers and Sons, which we borrowed extensively from the Massachusetts Historical Association. It was a great exhibit, papers and artifacts from both John Adams and John Quincy Adams. But that is the exception rather than the rule to presidential documents. So Roosevelt came to the Archivist of the United States with the proposition. He said, I have an estate in Hyde Park. I will pay to have the building built, and I will donate, and there's a funny story which I will tell you, I will donate the property for the building to be built if you will maintain it and staff it with archivists. And the Archivist of the United States agreed, and work soon began. It began in the Roosevelt administration, and he actually drew the plans for the building. So the building is Dutch colonial architecture, and there are sketches there at the Roosevelt Library that Roosevelt made of what the building was supposed to look like, and then began moving the papers to the Roosevelt Library. On dedication day, when the library was built, and Roosevelt had failed to inform his mother that he had given away the property for the library. You see, he didn't really own the estate. His mother owned the estate. And part of the deal was the land had to be titled over to the federal government, so he went to his mother, and after some discussion, the land was titled over to the National Archives. That system worked during the Roosevelt administration. When Truman came to office, he decided that this was a good system of preserving presidential documents. He also decided to put a presidential library at his home in Independence, Missouri. I was in Independence, Missouri just last week. We had dinner on the grounds of his home where he lived until 1972. His wife lived there until 1982. It's a marvelous library. Independence is still, although it's close to Kansas City, it's still a very small town, and you get that small town feel of President Truman. And he instituted an act, the Presidential Libraries Act, which said that basically instituted this system that if a president decided that he wanted to deed his papers to the government, there would be a mechanism where a foundation would be established to raise all the money for the building of the library, and it would be built. And every president followed that example except for Richard Nixon. And there are reasons that Richard Nixon, he had intended to, but there are reasons that he didn't. And so that system has worked. And in fact, in the 1960s, Herbert Hoover, who was still alive in the 1960s, he didn't die in 1964, which is an amazing fact most people forget, came to the National Archives and decided he wanted to move his papers from Stanford University, his presidential papers, to his home. So we have a presidential library for every president from Herbert Hoover through Bill Clinton, and the Nixon presidential birthplace, where the papers haven't been stored. They've been stored in Washington, D.C. all these years. Those papers will be moved out of Washington, D.C., out to Yorba Linda, California, and that will become a presidential library probably later this year or the first part of next year. And of course, the reason Nixon's papers did not go to a presidential library is because they were seized. And the reason they were seized is because he had wanted to destroy his tapes 5 years after he left office. And Congress was afraid that they would not be able to document the abuses of what they saw as the abuses of Watergate, so all of his papers were seized. And I think part of the reason that President Ford pardoned Nixon was because these papers were all sitting in the White House, and this whole legal thing was going on and on and on, and the country needed to get past it. And so we're finally going to get a Nixon presidential library. The Nixon situation also changed the law that governed presidential records. From George Washington all the way through Jimmy Carter, a president could do whatever he wanted to with his papers. He absolutely, positively, 100% owned them. Beginning with Ronald Reagan, when a president leaves office, he no longer owns his presidential documents. They are now federal documents. So Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and the future Bush, as we like to call him, Bush 43, those are all now federal records. And the older presidential libraries, if you go to do research in an older presidential library from Herbert Hoover through Jimmy Carter, and they haven't processed something, they simply tell you, I'm sorry, you can't have that, we haven't processed it. And you can't invoke what we call the Freedom of Information Act, because the Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply, because they're not federal papers, they're donated historical materials, and the federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over donated historical materials. For Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and the Bush Future 43, they're federal records, and you can invoke something called the Freedom of Information Act, or what we refer to as the FOIA. And if you're willing to get into a queue, first in, first out, we will process what you're looking for. Now, there are several problems with it. When you process a collection under a donor's deed of gift, you do, let's say we're doing the press office files. We do box 1 of the press office files. We move on to box 2 of the press office files until we've finished with all the press office, one box right after another. If somebody invokes the FOIA and says they want everything on the Gulf War, well, there may be Gulf War material spread over hundreds of collections. And in fact, my two archivists back there can tell you they are in fact spread over hundreds of collections. So instead of processing a box, you're processing a folder. And you have to pull that folder out of a box, and because we're archivists and we're a bit odd, we believe that because that folder was in a certain place in that box, it means something to the rest of the files, both to the left of it and to the right of it, so we have to keep track of where that folder came from. And where under a donor's deed of gift, you reviewed for specific invasion of privacy. Under the FOIA, you have to review for several other things. So, and it all has to come out, and it all has to be put in an artificial collection, and then someday it all has to go back. So it takes about 4 times as long to process under FOIA that it does under systematic processing. The good thing about it, though, is that if you don't want to see the press office files, you don't have to look at the press office files. You fill out a FOIA, and you get to see what you want to see. Unfortunately, I think our backlog now is maybe 3 years, maybe longer, maybe longer. So that's kind of the history of the presidential libraries. And as I was saying, the history of state archives go back years and years and years. There's a story, it doesn't really have to do with the Bush Library, but I think it's a neat story, and I'm the speaker, so I'm going to tell you about it. Just to show you how far state archives go back. When the Jews were released from bondage in Babylon, they went back to Jerusalem. They wanted to build a temple. The first temple had been destroyed. They wanted to build a second temple. Well, it took them years and years and years before they actually got around to building the second temple. And by the time they got around to building the second temple, the local inhabitants, the non-Jewish local inhabitants, were not pleased that they were starting to rebuild the second temple. In fact, they did not want them to build a second temple, and they sent letters to authorities saying, what are these guys up to? They're building this temple. They've got no jurisdiction to build a temple. The Jewish leaders, of course, said, well, there was a decree during the reign of Cyrus the Great when we were released from Babylon that said we could go home and build a temple. And these other people said, no, 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 no. So King Darius issued an order that the archives of Persia should be searched. And a scroll was found in Media. And this is the way it reads. And if you go to Ezra, it's pretty interesting because it actually says memorandum, semicolon. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple in Jerusalem. And it basically says, let the temple be built. And it goes on and on and on about how it's to be built. And at the very end, it's kind of like, one of these things. I, Darius, so it has been said, so it has been done. I, Darius, have decreed it, let it be carried out. So in the Bible, a very early evidence of these archives. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Bush Library, since that's what we're here to talk about. I don't know a lot about the very, very early history, but what I can tell you is Michael Halbooty came to President Bush in November of 1988, right after Bush had been elected. So he's not even president now. He's president-elect. And he's having a meeting. George Bush has called people into the White House, or into the White House to talk about energy policy. And Michael Halbooty is one of the people that the president-elect has called in to talk about energy policy. So on the way out of the office, as he's getting ready to leave, Michael Halbooty says, Mr. President, why don't you consider Texas A&M for your presidential library? And President Bush, as Michael Halbooty says, looks like he's just hit him over the head. He's a little taken aback. He's not even president of the United States yet, and somebody's already asking him to put his presidential library at Texas A&M. Halbooty had been a very good friend of President Bush's. And Bush is like, well, I'm not even president yet. I'm only president-elect. I really haven't even, you're here talking about energy policy. We're just getting started in it. That's a decision to make later. Halbooty says, are you saying no? And President Bush says, well, no, I'm not saying no. He says, then it's okay if I ask them. And Bush says, well, yeah, but make it clear to them that I'm not interested in talking about the presidential library yet. Well, as Michael Halbooty says, he went full steam ahead. It's not a no. So he came to Texas A&M and started talking to the officials at Texas A&M. A committee was formed, an exploratory committee on the presidential library. Of course, everyone thought it was a great idea. So what's the next step? We got to get President Bush here to give a speech. How soon can we get him here? Commencement. Let's get him here for commencement. So they invite President Bush to come to speak for the spring commencement ceremonies. President Bush says yes. Ha-ha, they got him now. They actually planned from picking up to the airport almost every detail of the trip. Take him by the site, show him where the site was going to be, how they were going to connect it to campus so it wouldn't be isolated from the campus. And they go over to the Board of Regents to have lunch, and they have this little group standing in the wing, and I think it's Perry Atkinson, but it might have been Halbooty, but I think it's Perry Atkinson. Says, listen, we got this little group that we'd like you to talk to. Do you mind going over and speaking to them real quick? And John Sununu, who was with the president, says, Mr. President, we're on a very tight schedule. We don't have time for this. We got a bunch of people we got to meet. You don't have time to go meet with this group. And I think it must have been Hal Booty that was in the group. President Bush says, you know, these are friends of mine. I'm going to go over and talk to them. And so they've got a rendition, initial rendition of what the building was look like, and he absolutely loves it. And Michael Hal Booty pulls out of his pocket the presidential returns for Houston, Rice, and Texas A&M. Now you must realize that Reagan was going to put his library at Stanford University initially. It's not there, it's at Simi Valley. There was some controversy. The Stanford faculty had voted not to accept the library. So in the back part of President Bush's mind, all this time must be that, am I going to run into the same situation that President Reagan ran into and have to move my library to another site? So Hal Booty tells him that the poll results for Rice are Dukakis 61%, Bush 36%. For Houston, Dukakis 69%, Bush 26%. Texas A&M, Bush 81%. Dukakis 19. And of course, Hal Booty says, does that make a difference? And President Bush says, well, yeah, actually, that does make a difference. And President Bush, shortly after that, picked Texas A&M very early in his administration. Bush 43, as you know, is only just now selecting the site. President Bush, very early in his administration, in his first term, picked Texas A&M to be the site. And that's kind of where I come into the picture. I worked with the vice presidential records over at the National Archives, and I got to know the person that was going to be the first director down here. And so we believed that we had 6 more years the National Archives believed they had 6 more years to begin planning for this library, but as you know, that didn't happen. In June, June of his final year, 1992, things started to look bad, and we started to make quiet plans for a presidential library in College Station. Not loud plans, because you can't make loud plans, but we started to make quiet plans and began arranging the staff to come down here. They asked me if I would be interested, and I said, yes, I'd very much be interested. I'd been at the Reagan Library at the beginning of that library, and it was just a fun time getting the library established. So I said I would be very happy to come to Texas A&M if, in fact, he lost the election and that's where it was going to go to. Well, he did lose the election. So our next step, like 2 days after the election, was to come to College Station, Texas. And we began looking around the city. And you may remember College Station, Texas in late 1992. There had been a banking crisis and also been an oil crisis. So the town is in much better shape now than it was in late 1992. So, which was good for us, though, because there was a lot of vacant property around. And we chose a site over on University Drive, a major thoroughfare, that had a big open space that had been a bowling alley. And before that, it had been a Fed Mart. So it was a grocery store operation, so it had what we needed. It had a loading dock. And in fact, it had a 2-bay loading dock, which was just great. So I went over to the White House with the staff. There was the director that had been selected for the project, and I guess it was a staff of about 20 of us from the National Archives, and we pretty much took tape measures. And we began opening up people's file drawers and measuring their file drawers, because we needed to know how many records were coming out of the White House. Now you can imagine what we looked like. We looked like the undertaker that was coming in to measure the body for the coffin. So we had to be careful about the way we did it, because people were getting ready to lose their jobs, and people were filling out resumes. But we calculated how much material was coming out of the White House, and we began palletizing it. We put pallets everywhere in the old EOB, the old Executive Office Building. They filled up all the floors. And the volume of material that was in the Executive Office Building was mirrored by the volume of the material that was at the National Archives, because the White House had run out of space and they had started shipping stuff to the National Archives. So we had this huge volume of material at the National Archives and this huge volume of material at the White House. On January 13th or 14th, we made our first shipment. I think it was 21 tractor trailers. We took them, that's gifts and papers. We took them out, we drove them out to Andrews Air Force Base. I was here in College Station at the bowling alley, keeping the shelvers one step ahead of the material that was coming in. We were actually, when the material started arriving, we were still putting up shelving units. They were all these materials were loaded onto these huge, very noisy C-5A cargo planes. They can carry a tremendous amount of material. That was done at Andrews Air Force Base. They were all flown out to Fort Hood on January the 15th. They were then taken off these very noisy C-5A cargo planes and put back on transfer trucks like at 2 o'clock in the morning. In fact, when we loaded the planes, we put an armed guard at each end of the plane. And they stood there all night long guarding the material. We had this huge perimeter around the material. The next morning, we began very early, starting to load this material on these trucks, and we convoyed from Fort Hood down here. And every small town in Texas we went through, the sheriff or the local constable was standing in the middle of the intersection with his pistols on. So we were very well protected. We got here at, I think, 4 or 5 in the morning on January the 15th, and we had brought these soldiers down from Fort Hood with us. These marvelous soldiers from Fort Hood had been in the first Desert Storm and just loved President Bush. The foulest mouthed kids I have ever met in my life, but the hardest working kids I've ever run across. It was their job. We had propane powered jacks staged in order to get the materials off the trucks. They would drop these pallets on the floor. These kids had what we call at the National Archives streamliners. They're like very long dollies. They can hold probably maybe 100 boxes. These kids, who were in great shape, would load these things up. Their commander had a stopwatch, and they would race to see who could unload their dolly first. And we had pre-marked all the boxes with shelf locations corresponding to the temporary facility, exactly where the boxes would go. So it would say shelf 6, row 6, first position. They had it all done by about 10:30 or 11 o'clock. They were amazing. And all we had to give them was pizza and beer. And it was great. And they were great kids. They foul-mouthed. There was 2 kids, Patia and Rosenboom. They were like Laurel and Hardy. One was tall and thin, while the other one was fat and kind of stocky. And they could use certain words in the vocabulary as verbs, adjectives, nouns, pronouns. It was just amazing. And they could say 5 or 6 of these words in a row, and you could get the gist of what they were saying. It was amazing. We stored the material, and then, of course, this whole process, there were files that had to be kept in the White House for ongoing government business. So this is the 15th of January. This is before the administration even ends. So this process was recreated again on the 21st. Same number of trailers, I believe. Same kids came down once again. They all had the stuff on the shelf again by 11 o'clock. So it happened twice. And there was only 3 of us at the time. So we began doing the best we could with processing the papers. We mostly responded to some ongoing litigation that crossed over from the administration, and the president still had, the former president still had ongoing business. So we were pulling files for him to respond to correspondence that he'd gotten within the last month of the administration. So that kept us busy for a while. The 3 of us, just 3 people, running this whole thing. It wasn't enough. And then we began hiring staff, first archivists and administrative officials. And we had all this stuff. We had all this classified material we were storing. And CRS had been chosen as the architect. And they had been a College Station firm. They were bought by HOK, and God bless them. They actually came over and sat down with us several times and said, "What do you need in a building?" It was like amazing. Nobody's ever asked. And so we were able, the new building, we kind of were able to design what type of building we wanted, which was fantastic. Big, wide hallways. In fact, I had somebody come in and say, "Why are the hallways so big in this building?" Well, because we're carrying pallets down these hallways. And the ceilings are pretty tall in parts of the building. And why are the ceilings so tall? Well, because, you know, when you got the Berlin Wall and you're moving the Berlin Wall around, in fact, the ceilings I don't think are quite tall enough. I think we had to put the Berlin Wall on its side. But they began building the new building, and they asked us what we wanted. We were limited in size. The building we have looks big, but we really need a building that's a little bit bigger because we're completely full. But President Bush, 41, his presidential library was the first to come under an amendment to the Presidential Libraries Act that said a building couldn't be over 70,000 square feet. So all other presidential libraries can be over 70,000 square feet, but all libraries after ours can only be 70,000 square feet. So we're basically full. But they built a library to our design, and then the process I talked about on January 15th and 21st happened again in August of 2000 and we've been there 10 years, so it would have been August of 1997, thank you. August of 1997, we did this whole process again. And all the while, we were designing a museum and installing a museum, finding artifacts for the museum, and all that kind of stuff. I'll tell you a story that there's this great story. We had a reporter come to the library and ask us, is this all the material that you're going to get? We have 100,000 artifacts now, 1 million pages of presidential, 38 million to 40 million pages of presidential records, depending on who you ask, and about 1 million photographs. That's the collection. Had a reporter come over one day and ask, is this all the material that you're ever going to get? And the director at the time said, no, we'll still get material. In fact, recently some Truman documents were found squirreled away in a drawer at the White House. The next day, we're reading the paper, and it wasn't the Eagle, it was another paper. We're reading the paper, and we're two guys from Alabama, we're not in the paper much, so we went and got the paper quick because we wanted to see ourselves in the paper. And the director and I am reading. Now, he's in his office and I'm in my office, and we get to the same paragraph at the same time. And he yells out to me, did I say that? Louder than that. And I said, no, you didn't say that. The story says, Dave Alsterbrook says, the library will always get more papers. In fact, Truman's pet squirrel was recently found in a drawer at the White House and sent to the Truman Library. So, I've always been careful what I said to the press from it on. And there's just another great story I've got to tell you. There was an article in a magazine, an academic magazine, that said, very early in our history, that said that President Bush's papers were languishing away in a small town in East Texas, being ignored, and they were being stored in an old bowling alley in College Station. The director, it's just horrible sounding, it's just horrible sounding. The director wrote a letter back, which I thought was great, said that the papers actually weren't languishing away. There was a professional staff of archivists that were going through the papers and helping preserve them and helping document them for history, and that we took great exception to the fact that we were being called unprofessional. But he said, we took greatest exception to the fact that the article had said that they were being stored in an old bowling alley, because we weren't just an old bowling alley, we were also a Chinese restaurant too. So there's actually two components to the building, Chinese restaurant and a bowling alley. We moved into the new building. It's a beautiful building. We have this great relationship with Texas A&M. Have you been out there? I mean, the grounds are just immaculate. They're just immaculate. There's this one guy, John, who's out there almost all the time, who does a great job. We began processing. We hired archivists. We processed the papers. We began making them available to the public, which is kind of a long, drawn-out process. It takes a little bit longer than we would like, but we are diligently processing the papers and making them available to the public. The photographs are almost all out there for review. Not many photos are closed at all. And we've been processing, my staff back here is my declass staff. They've been declassifying the papers and making them available to the public as they come open. We've been there now 10 years. It's hard to believe we've been there 10 years. And in that process, we have found so much material that we did not know existed. Letters, photographs, and film. So this year we decided that it was time, well, not this year, a couple years ago we decided that it was time to redo the museum. We had all this glorious material we had found, and we needed to put it into the museum. And so we began a process of about 2 years, which is underway right now, and I have to apologize for the museum being closed, but it's the only way we can do it. We closed down the museum this year, and we are now installing a new exhibit. And it's amazing, the material that we found. Pictures of President Bush when he was a boy, pictures of Mrs. Bush when she was a young girl, Mrs. Bush's family, George Bush's family, motion picture coverage that we didn't know, President Bush playing in the very first college baseball World Series. We have this great film. He sunk some of the very first wells out in the Gulf of Mexico. And we have this great film that was created by Zapata, this industrial film of this huge derrick going down the Mississippi River underneath the bridge at Baton Rouge, and underneath the bridge at New Orleans out into the Gulf of Mexico. And then showing the derrick being set up, and it was a brand new design. It was a three-legged derrick, and showing the legs being jacked into the sand and the derrick rising up out of the water. It's material like that that we must use because it's just such of such historical significance. The one thing people wanted to see when they came to the museum, President Bush decided, and we also decided that we didn't want to have an Oval Office because every other presidential library has an Oval Office. What do you think is the one thing people want to see when they come to the library? I always say I'm right about 90% of the time. Well, we were wrong. So we're putting in an Oval Office. Now, you say, how can you make your Oval Office unique? Well, every other presidential library has an Oval Office where you walk up to a bar and you peer into it. You can't get into the Oval Office. Our Oval Office, you can actually walk into it, sit behind the desk. There'll be a docent that'll pull out a camera and will snap the visitor's picture behind the desk. And you ask, how can you do that? Well, it's amazing what you can get on eBay. We have somebody donated to us a replica. President Bush used a partner's desk where the drawers are on both ends of the desk or on both sides. Somebody had a partner's desk and donated it to us. So we can put a partner's desk, exactly like the one President Bush used, into the Oval Office, not original artifact. And all the desk set and all the materials he had on his desk, you can recreate either by finding items like it on the internet or in antique shops, or by recreating the pictures that he had on the desk. So you can sit behind the desk. One of the things people are very intrigued about is the White House Situation Room. So we thought, we'll recreate the White House Situation Room. And in order to get visitors a feeling of kind of what goes in the White House Situation Room, we've created several scenarios. Would you commit troops in Desert Storm? What are the possibilities if you do or you don't, and what President Bush did? So you can kind of play out several games in this White House Situation Room. The one thing we're getting rid of is the Air Force One. It's an exhibit a lot of people like, but the Reagan Library has the whole plane. So, and it's not the new Air Force One, of course, it's the old Air Force One, but if you want to see Air Force One and what it looked like, it seemed a little counterproductive for us when we needed the space to recreate an Air Force One cabin when the Reagan Library has the entire plane. So we're using that space for the Oval Office and also for the Situation Room. And we're redoing the Gulf War exhibit. The former Gulf War exhibit was a great exhibit, but you have to realize all that technology is now 10 years old. And that technology is now 10 years old, and it doesn't work anymore. And so we're using, where we used to use CD players and DVD players, we're now using solid state equipment to run the video. So where you had a box that was about this big, you have a box that's about that big now to run, and they're a lot more robust. And where we had huge monitors that set out from the wall this far, we have flat screen monitors that sit on the wall. So there are all these new technologies. I believe you're going to love it. We're going to open November 9th and 10th. Are there any questions?